Okay, hello there. Welcome to Dimwits, Dipshots, Dufuses, and Dullards, episode 2. So, why did I self censor there? Well, because YouTube has this wonderful little policy where if you say certain swear words within the first 2 minutes, it kind of messes with the video's ability to get views and maybe earn a little bit of money or whatever. It just messes with the video because they're a little bit censor happy over there. So anyway, this is a show where we basically focus on politics. It's a show within a show. It's part of the critical weight theory series. Again, a show within the show, and we're looking at a quadruple D of the week, which is basically the worst person of the week, and that includes the possibility that they're dimwits, dip shots, doofuses, or dullards. And there's also going to be a peripheral poop head of the week, someone who's under the radar but who deserves attention. Now, when I say under the radar, that doesn't mean they're not at all well known or whatever. It just means that they don't receive quite as much coverage. It doesn't necessarily mean somebody who's completely never getting headlines, but somebody that's kind of being ignored or under examined, especially at the moment. And the other segment is we look at a fetid fever dream flashback of the week. That's, basically some crazy scandal or something like that. Some just crazy event, some stupid event, some just nonsense that happened in the past. And this is all going to be from a largely anti authoritarian perspective, for lack of a better word, because those are basically what my views are. So, yeah, welcome to episode 2. And today, the focus, the quadruple D of the week, is going to be Benjamin Netanyahu. The leader of a country that we're not supposed to criticize, who's engaged in a hyperviolent series of policies that we're not allowed to criticize or call a genocide or anything like that. Apparently he's no worse than a fluffy little puppy, and you can kill 100,000 plus innocent civilians, and you're a good guy. You're the type of person, like a good neighbor that you'd invite over for a beer or something. Nothing wrong with somebody like that. So he's the quadruple D of the week, and I've got a fresh news story going on. So the details are that they're still coming in. So this is about efforts of people like Mr. Netanyahu. So on Thursday, which is today, Israeli airstrikes targeted Yemen's capital, Sana'a. Now, I might have mispronounced that. That's the first time I've seen that capital. I'm not exactly an expert at geography, but anyway, it's the capital and the port city of Hodeida, Hodeida, Hodeidah, and they're both under Houthi rebel control. The strikes damaged critical infrastructure, including Sana'a International Airport and power station in Aziz and Ras Kantib, which Israel claims the Houthis used to transport Iranian weapons. So during the bombardment, World Health Organization Director General Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, I may have mispronounced that, but anyway, he was at the airport preparing to board a flight. The attack injured a UN crew member and caused significant damage to the airport's facilities, including the air traffic control tower, departure lounge, and runway. Dr. Tedros reported that he and his colleagues were safe, but would need to wait for repairs before departing. So, how many stories have we heard like this, right? It seems like there have been plenty of them. You know, infrastructure just being destroyed, as if that's all that Netanyahu's actually good at, is just waging war. That's happening largely because of U.S. support as well. The Israeli military stated that the airstrikes targeted military infrastructure used by the Houthi terrorist regime. And, that's another thing I've noticed. If you ever want to badmouth somebody, just call it a regime. And I don't know when that rule came into effect, but, can we refer to like a Netanyahu regime? Does it's a little bit silly, and of course they've used that sort of thing even back when Obama was in office. It seemed to originate back in the George W. Bush days when the term regime change was so much in vogue, and George W. Bush really saw a deep need to overthrow Saddam Hussein, who was somebody that the United States had previously supported, even giving him favored nation trading status. And also, of course, you have pictures of Donald Rumsfeld shaking his hand and all that kind of stuff. And, well, maybe I should make that much about the handshaking thing because when you're engaged in world affairs, you're going to shake hands with people, even people that might not be your allies. There are reasons people do that, so maybe I shouldn't even criticize Donald Rumsfeld that well. But I guess one point that I would raise though is that when I was opposing the Iraq War, you know, it was often said that I was allies with Saddam Hussein and stuff like that. But you know what? I never shook his hand. I never shook that mofo's hand, unlike Donald Rumsfeld. And of course, Saddam Hussein enjoyed support going all the way back to the JFK administration, believe it or not. And you don't hear about that very often. But there's an old New York Times article that I read about that in, and it is also true. It's been noted in other newspapers, but you kind of have to dig for it. Even though we live in an information age, it seems like a lot of stuff just gets easily buried or overlooked. And that seems like kind of a major detail that people really ought to know about. And maybe I'm getting a bit sidetracked here. I don't know. But to me, it seems sort of relevant when we're talking about history's evils, like how often the United States will end up supporting the very same evils that it claims to be opposing. But anyway, you know, uh, Israel said that it was attacking the Houthi terrorist regime at the airport and power stations. So these actions follow Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's warning that the Houthis would face consequences similar to those experienced by Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Assad regime. Oh, and also the entire population of any country that Netanyahu strikes and sees no need whatsoever to hold back or, not attack critical infrastructure or, um, just try to let aid in and stuff like that. Make it so that refugees have a place to go and that there's a strategy of, helping people who are relatively innocent, including children, actually survive the onslaught. But of course, they are deliberately targeting these people. The government under Netanyahu even has a clear strategy of intentionally starving these people, treating them as if they are all, committing terrorist acts, which is a pretty freaky thing considering that, you know, if you're a child or whatever, chances are you have not even been able to learn about all the ways of the world, let alone like commit a terrorist act. But you know, that sort of doesn't matter when you're hell bent on waging war and just destroying everything that you possibly can. All of these universities and cultural centers have been destroyed. I don't know how many aid workers have been killed. There have been journalists who've been killed. It's probably not possible to even find a single restaurant or anything like that that's still standing. But Netanyahu's a good guy. But anyway, the Iran-backed Houthis confirmed the strikes via their media outlet, but provided no immediate details. Houthi media reported 3 fatalities and 14 injuries resulting from the attacks. That's according to the New York Post. Not the most reputable news source, but I think I think they could very well be correct in this case. And these developments occur amid escalating tensions, with the Houthis launching missile and drone attacks against Israel in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. Over the weekend, a Houthi missile struck a playground in Tel Aviv, injuring 16 people. In response, Israeli jets conducted airstrikes in Sana'a and Hodeida last week, resulting in 9 deaths. The Houthis also have targeted shipping in the Red Sea corridor, further intensifying regional instability. And that's just me being objectively reporting on what PBS has stated. And PBS is probably a relatively neutral source. And the United Nations has expressed concern over the situation, noting that the targeted ports are vital entry points for humanitarian aid. And that's probably why they have been struck, because one of the intentions of Netanyahu is to ruin the potential for any humanitarian aid to get through. And Dr. Tedros was in Yemen to negotiate the release of detained UN staff and assess the humanitarian crisis. So that's according to the Associated Press. In a related incident, an Israeli strike outside a hospital in the Gaza Strip killed 5 Palestinians overnight recently, and Gaza's health ministry identified them as journalists working for a local news outlet, while the Israeli military claimed they were militants posing as reporters. That's according to the Associated Press, or the AP. And, that's another pattern of Netanyahu and his supporters. They'll claim that, anyone that they kill was probably a militant posing as somebody else, whether it's reporters who have died or aid workers or whatever. It's been happening pretty consistently throughout this entire thing. And these events highlight the complex and volatile dynamics of the region, of course, with multiple actors engaged in ongoing conflicts that have significant humanitarian implications. So, I don't want to say that Netanyahu is solely responsible for what's going on, or anything like that, but at the end of the day, he's the one who has the most power. He could be taking more steps to prevent situations like this and de-escalate things, but that's not his modus operandi. So if you want to know the sources here, you have the Times with headlines saying Israeli airstrikes in Yemen amid rising tensions. New York Post, their headline is Israel launches widespread strikes on Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen in retaliation for drone missile attacks. And the Wall Street Journal, their headline is Israel intensifies strikes on Houthis, hits Yemen airport and power stations. So, this is part of why Benjamin Netanyahu is the quadruple D of the week. And yeah, it's just one of those things. He's one of those people you're not supposed to criticize, but here I am. I'm criticizing him. And I mean, one of the criticisms of the critics of Netanyahu is that, well, the Palestinian people all must be supporting Hamas or whatever. So the stupid thing about that critique is pretty straightforward. If the aim is to make Palestinians view Hamas in a less positive light, then wouldn't you actually be extending a sort of olive branch to them? Wouldn't you be trying to help them, escape from the, you know, the the violence? And if anything, they're they're made more dependent on Hamas, or frankly anyone else who would offer any hope of survivability in this situation. There's nothing about what Netanyahu is doing that is going to make anyone less radical. I mean, let's be real here. And, that's really all I need to say about it at this point. So moving on, who is the peripheral poophead of the week? Well, that's Benny Gantz, or maybe it's pronounced Benny Gantz. I don't know. I've never really heard the pronunciation of that name uh, as he wants it pronounced, but let's just call him Benny. Um, Different from Netanyahu, but still named Benny. He was born on June 9th, 1959, and he's a prominent Israeli politician and retired Army general. He served as the 20th Chief of General Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, or the IDF, from 2011 to 2015, overseeing significant military operations during his tenure. In December 2018, Gantz transitioned into politics by establishing the Israel Resilience Party, which later allied with Telem and Yesh Atid to form the Blue and White Alliance, named after the colors of the Israeli national flag. So, hyper patriotism there, I suppose. The imagery of the flag, used to ostensibly shut down critiques of the party and all that stuff. So, we see that in American politics all the time. So, I guess from a certain perspective, it's refreshing to know that the United States is not the only country that kind of stupidly uses flag symbolism to hide its policies behind. But anyway, Gantz's political career includes serving as the 17th Speaker of the Knesset, or the Knesset. I've heard it pronounced both ways, so if you want, you can correct me on that. But I've heard the K be silent, and I've heard it not be silent. But anyway, he was the Speaker from March to May 2020. In April 2020, he agreed to join a rotation government with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, assuming the roles of alternate Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, with an agreement to succeed Netanyahu as Prime Minister in November 2021. However, the coalition collapsed, leading to another election in 2021. As Defense Minister, Gantz oversaw Operation Guardian of the Walls, quite a name, in Gaza. In June 2021, he was reappointed as Defense Minister and became Deputy Prime Minister in the Bennett Lapid government, serving until December 2022. Following the outbreak of the Israel Hamas war on October 12th, 2023, Gantz's National Unity Party announced the formation of a war cabinet with Likud. Gantz was appointed as a minister without portfolio in the 37th government, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu. He and Gadi Eisenkot, I may have mispronounced that one as well. But anyway, he exited the cabinet on June 13th, 2024, shortly before its dissolution. So, from my perspective, and this is where I'm, going to take real digs at this guy. Gantz's military and political roles should be viewed critically, particularly concerning state authority and the use of force. His leadership during Operation Guardian of the Walls in Gaza should be scrutinized for the military actions taken against Palestinian territories, which resulted in significant civilian casualties and infrastructure damage. I advocate for peaceful societies and generally question the merits of hierarchical structures, so I interpret Gantz's actions as reinforcing state violence and oppression and practically nothing more. Gantz's political alliances, notably with right leaning parties, and his participation in coalition governments led by Netanyahu, are perpetuating existing power structures, of course, and doing little else. Obviously, they're not leading to peaceful strategies or anything like that. And his involvement in the formation of a war cabinet during the Israel Hamas conflict further exemplifies his commitment to state centric solutions, which contrasts with my principles advocating for non hierarchical and non violent approaches to conflict resolution, which I still think, based on the present information, will be the only way to approach these issues with any degree of success. They're going to have to come from the bottom up, not from the top down. And unfortunately, I just don't see that happening at the moment, so the slaughter continues. Benny Gantz's career reflects a trajectory from military leadership to significant political influence within the Israeli state apparatus. From my viewpoint, his actions exemplify the reinforcement of state power and the use of military force in addressing geopolitical conflicts, which are antithetical to my ideals of decentralization, voluntary cooperation, and peace. So, tellingly, both for him and the organization, he spoke at APAC 2020 to spread his pro war and pro genocide propaganda, and again, very little else. These people have nothing to offer the world other than power and violence and various scandals related to power and violence. So, moving on from that cheery analysis, who constitutes the fetid fever dream flashback of the week? Who is the clown that presented a fetid fever dream? Well, it's none other than Benjamin Netanyahu yet again. I figured once I was looking into, present day news related to his efforts, why not look at a not so distant scandal, but something that's kind of not receiving as much coverage because of, the violence going on right now. So, what is the biggest scandal involving Benjamin Netanyahu, and how could I address it from, a non-authoritarian perspective? So, Netanyahu, he's Israel's largest or longest serving prime minister. I suppose he might be the largest one in terms of size. I don't really know, but he certainly had a large negative impact on people's perception of the country that he's running into the ground. But anyway, he has been involved in several high-profile scandals over the years. The biggest and most consequential of these scandals, aside from the genocide allegations, centers around corruption allegations, particularly Case 1000, Case 2000, and Case 4000, which involve bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. So what does that exactly mean? What does that entail? So here are the key details of the scandal, or sort of a collection of scandals, sort of a cornucopia of scandals. So Case 1000 was known as the Gifts Affair, in which Netanyahu and his family allegedly received expensive gifts from wealthy individuals, including Israeli American Hollywood producer Arnon Milchan, in exchange for favors. These included assisting Milchan in obtaining a U.S. visa and promoting legislation favorable to him. So that sounds a little bit like Clarence Thomas and that Harlan Crow fella, if you remember, which, as far as I know, nothing has happened regarding that either. But anyway, moving on to Case 2000, that's known as the media influence affair. So in that scandal, Netanyahu is accused of negotiating with Arnon Moses, the publisher of Israelis, or the largest Israeli newspaper, and that's called Yedioth Ronoth. I probably did not pronounce that correctly, but I don't really speak the language. But anyway, that was he did that. He was supposedly negotiating to secure positive media coverage in exchange for legislation that would weaken a rival newspaper, and that newspaper is known as Israel Hayom. And Case 4000 is known as the Bezek Walla affair, perhaps the most significant scandal. This case alleges that Netanyahu granted regulatory benefits worth hundreds of millions of dollars to Bezek, Israel's largest telecom company, in exchange for favorable coverage from Walla, a news website owned by Bezek's majority shareholder. So, yeah, I mean, in addition to being a violent person, Netanyahu is, engaged in all these other scandals. So, you can say what you want about one aspect of his character, but you've got this other stuff you could also criticize here. So Netanyahu has consistently denied wrongdoing, of course. It's called the investigations a witch hunt, and gee, why does that sound familiar? And he's accused law enforcement and media of attempting to oust him from power. Well, why would anyone want to do that, especially at this point? You know, it's a it's a weird thing, when you've got all these powerful figures who are doing all these shitty things, and then they're like, well, why do they want to hold us accountable for these things? These are all just witch hunts and whatnot. So, from my perspective, here's my assessment. My analysis sees this scandal through the lens of systemic critique, emphasizing the structural conditions of state power, capital, and media consolidation that enable such corruption. And, the corruption is a symptom of state capital nexus. I often argue that the modern state inherently serves the interests of the ruling class and corporate elites. This would be no exception. Netanyahu's alleged actions, exchanging regulatory favors for personal gain, demonstrate how state leaders often operate as intermediaries between concentrated capital and governance. In this framework, corruption is not an aberration, but a predictable outcome of hierarchical systems that concentrate power in the hands of a few individuals. This is largely about media manipulation and propaganda, which is how power operates. The cases highlight how control over media narratives can be weaponized by political elites to maintain power. My critique emphasizes the dangers of media monopolies and the erosion of independent journalism under capitalist systems. Netanyahu's alleged negotiations with media and entities reflect the broader dynamic in which state and corporate interests collude to suppress dissent and manufacture consent, to borrow language from Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman. Well, technically, manufacturing consent goes back further than that as a term, but Noam Chomsky kind of popularized it in the modern era. And a lot of this also hinges on the illusions of democracy rather than actual democracy. From my viewpoint, scandals like these expose the limits of representative democracy, where voters are led to believe in the accountability of elected officials. Instead, such systems often perpetuate the rule of oligarchic elites who act with impunity. And Netanyahu's ability to maintain power despite legal troubles and just being a violent maniac could be seen as evidence of the state's prioritization of so called stability and continuity over justice and accountability. So, a lot of it also comes down to the reinforcement of hierarchical systems. Netanyahu's actions, if proven, and I'm sure a lot of them could be, illustrate how hierarchical systems enable those at the top to exploit public resources and wield power for personal benefit. I advocate dismantling such structures in favor of decentralized, non hierarchical models of governments that eliminate these opportunities for abuse. And, some people would say that's me taking a stance against state government. And I suppose if it is, so be it. If the state does not really function in the way that it's supposed to, then people ought to consider replacing it or any other system of power with something else. And that includes, a system that's purportedly of people power. If if the people do nothing but abuse each other and all that kind of stuff, then maybe maybe it's time to also take the people out of power and get rid of the opportunities for violence altogether. And when it comes to Netanyahu, that includes the instrumentalization of the legal system. I would critique the focus on Netanyahu as an individual too, arguing that the broader system allows similar behavior by other politicians and corporate executives, often without consequences. So, that might be seen as a little bit of self-critique. It's it's not just the fact that there's a person named so and so in this position of power. You could replace them with a lot of different people, and they might be acting in very similar fashion. I think we've seen that time and time again. It kind of doesn't matter in a lot of cases who you put in there. If their general framework and general ideology are the same, and they rationalize the worst in human behavior, you're really just going to have a change of figureheads at the top. And that's unless you have more democracy from the bottom up and more efforts to limit such people from ever being able to attain power. And that's that's really a battle that's been going on down the ages. So, prosecution of high profile figures can serve as a distraction from systemic issues. That's not to say it should never happen, but let's not overlook the commonality of such scandals and of such violence. You know, if you focus too much on the individual, who's experiencing the scandal, it kind of gives the illusion of accountability while preserving the underlying power structures, which are really at the root of the scandals themselves. So, this is about broader implications here. From my perspective, the Netanyahu scandal, it really underscores the inherent corruption of hierarchical institutions, whether political or economic, rather than addressing individual cases as the sole media focus. I would argue for dismantling these structures and replacing them with horizontal participatory systems that prevent the concentration of power and ensure collective accountability rather than, you know, making everything about some powerful individual at the top who will inevitably either fall short or just prove catastrophically, abysmally destructive to the society and all that fun stuff. So, well, that was uh, quite a rant or maybe a series of rants. And hopefully, you found this to be an informative and thought provoking episode. And um, yeah, I better wind things down here. And hope you have a great day. Hope you learned something.